We'll now continue with the reading of the text for this afternoon. And the text will be Mark 8, verses 27 to 38. We can read that together now. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist. And others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Thus far, the reading of our text this afternoon. So brothers and sisters, and also a warm welcome to any visitors or who may be with us today on the live stream. Brothers and sisters, in a lot of ways, even with COVID-19, the Christian life in Canada has been and is pretty good. The Canadian Christian, compared to the Christians of previous ages and the Christians of other places in the world, is a pretty privileged Christian. The Christian church in Canada, for example, enjoys many advantages. Christians enjoy tax deductions. The main dominant public holidays are Christian holidays. Christians usually have buildings and places to worship, good seminaries to send their students to. Nobody harasses them on Sunday as they attend church. We could go on. Despite the current circumstances, this is still the case. Canadian Christians are generally quite successful, although not always. Christians in Canada run businesses, charities, universities even. Many Christians even participate in the political world and have long careers in politics. And when I see this, and we look outside our doors and we see where we're at as Christians in Canada, Jesus' words in our passage today seem somewhat jarring, don't they? Perhaps even puzzling. Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciples," this is the NIV, "whoever wants to be my disciples must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." And this is an incredibly powerful statement. And if I'm honest with you, these words are the words that have been ringing through my head ever since I came to seminary. I've never been able to escape them. And particularly when I was ordained, these words returned with a vengeance. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. And so, brothers and sisters, today we're going to investigate this statement and the rest of our passage. We're going to talk about what it means to live this out today in modern Canada. And we're going to hear this under this theme. If you would follow your suffering Lord, then you must be ready to deny yourself and pick up your cross. We'll see in the first place our right but inadequate confession, and second, to deny yourself and take up your cross. And so we'll start with the first point. Because in order to answer our question properly, we need to fully understand our passage. Our passage, Mark 8, verse 27 through 38. If you know anything about the book of Mark, this passage is pivotal. In fact, it's the hinge on which the whole book moves. The book of Mark is divided into two halves, and our passage straddles the two halves. In fact, it connects them, you could say. The first half of the book of Mark is strongly focused on Jesus' identity. Who is Jesus? This is the great question that comes up again and again. The first half comes to a climax in the first verses of our passage, verses 27 through 30. Because look at the question that Jesus asks, right? If you look at our passage, Jesus asks the question of the first half of the book. Right? Verse 27. Who do people say that I am? That's the question that Jesus has been pushing people to answer for the past 8 chapters. Later on in the second half of the book, Jesus will go on to his death and resurrection. But first, who do people say that I am? Who is Jesus? And so Jesus asks his disciples, and his disciples answer with their personal views. Interesting. Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others one of the prophets. It's kind of an obvious answer if you think about it. Given all of the miracles that Jesus has been doing, given the remarkable teaching that he's given, everyone logically concludes that Jesus must be someone special. But even Jesus' disciples who followed him around still can't really figure out what is so special about Jesus. Who is he actually? But then he goes, who do you say I am? Who do the disciples think that Jesus is? And Peter answers for the disciples who are beginning to get it. You are the Christ. Christ, of course, means anointed one. The Greek word for Messiah or king, anointed one. You are the coming King of Israel. That is who you are, Peter says. And it is a magnificent confession. And that confession is the climax for the first half of the book of Mark. In fact, the word Christ has not been used since chapter 1, verse 1. The whole first chapters are building towards this triumphal moment. Jesus is the Christ. Jesus orders his disciples to stay quiet about his true identity. He doesn't want to spark a premature rebellion against the government. He's not ready to fully reveal his glory quite yet. But then in verse 31, Jesus does something very unusual. Right? Here you have this majestic confession of Peter. You are the Christ. And we would expect all sorts of things to happen, but we don't expect what happens next, and it's quite remarkable. Look at what happens in verse 31. Look at how the next thing that Jesus says. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And after 3 days rise again. Now remember, we of course know that this stuff is going to happen. We know that Jesus is going to suffer at the hands of the chief priests and that he's going to die and rise again. We know that. But the disciples did not know that. And this is the first time, at least in the book of Mark, that the disciples learn what's going to happen to Jesus. And even though the disciples think that Jesus might be the Christ, the King of Israel, they never ever would have expected that confessing that Jesus is the King would then mean that they and him would suffer. Peter in particular thinks these words of suffering are ridiculous. Look what it says. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. It's funny. They're walking along a road, right? The disciples are walking. Jesus is probably walking a little bit ahead of them. And Jesus is teaching them as they're walking. And when Jesus teaches them this thing about suffering, this craziness, Peter walks up to him and pulls him to the side of the road and is like, hey, cut this out. No more of that talk. What you have to remember here is that before meeting Jesus, Peter is a member of a group called the Zealots. The Zealots are a Jewish rebel group. They wanted to violently overthrow the authorities of Israel, particularly the Romans and their lackeys who governed in Jerusalem. And so Peter, as a violent, jihadist, really, Peter is thrilled that Jesus has come to be the coming King of Israel. He is over the moon. It's Peter's hope to restore the nation of Israel. Peter hates the Romans. He wants Israel to be an independent nation once again, like it used to be. And so Peter thinks it's great that Jesus is the coming king. But then, strangely, Jesus begins talking about all this gloomy stuff. Suffering and rejection and all sorts of defeatist things. And so from Peter's perspective, that doesn't fit with who the coming king of Israel is supposed to be. From Peter's perspective, Jesus is like a soldier or a general who's lost his will to fight. Peter needs to stiffen Jesus up. He needs to pressure Jesus to stop this gloomy thinking. How dare Jesus talk about defeat? But Jesus' response to Peter is swift and strong. He stops on the road. They're walking along the road. He stops. He turns to face all of his disciples. And he says this remarkable rebuke. Get behind me, Satan. For you do not have in mind the things of God, but the concerns of men. Peter just confessed that Jesus is the King, the Christ, the one whom Israel has been expecting for centuries. Israel has been looking forward to the coming of the Christ for as long as anyone can remember. And Peter gets it when no one else does. And then, within a few sentences, Peter is rebuked and called Satan. And the question, of course, that we have and the disciples would have would be, what's behind this stunning reversal? How can Peter be so right one second and so wrong the next? What you have to understand is that Peter understood correctly that Jesus was the Christ. But he did not understand the fullness of what that meant. He did not understand that being the Christ, in God's terms, also entailed suffering and death for the sins of all humanity. And right at this instant, right in this moment, Jesus begins the road to the cross. The next chapters are all about his journey from Galilee to Judea to Jerusalem to outside Jerusalem and the cross. Because it's God's design that victory on this earth over death and sin involves the suffering and rejection of Jesus. Cosmic victory requires the suffering and death of the Son of God, and then the resurrection of the Son of God. Why? I mean, Jesus is obviously no Israelite king. He's of Israel, but his life is clearly meant to provide something far bigger than saving the nation of Israel. And what we're realizing in this chapter, what we're realizing in the book of Mark, is that Jesus is so much bigger than everyone thought he was. His scope of what he's doing is cosmic, not local. He's providing a response to Genesis 3, where man sinned against God and entailed and deserved the punishment of death for his sin and rebellion. But in Genesis 3, we realize that instead of destroying man for his sin and rebellion against God by taking the fruit, God decided to show mercy. The thing that we have to understand about God is that in order for God to show mercy to a people who deserve perfect punishment and justice, somebody had to take the penalty to satisfy God's perfect justice. And slowly over time, as we read the scriptures in the Old Testament, we begin to realize more and more the cost of mercy. That somebody had to pay for the sin, for our sin. Somebody. In our passage, we begin to realize that it's Jesus, and that Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is the King. Jesus is the one who's going to take the penalty for the wrath of God against sin. And that penalty entailed suffering and death. And by so doing, Jesus could provide forgiveness of sins, reconciliation, reuniting God with men and women who were estranged from God. And this helps us to answer an important question that comes up in our text. By enabling the reconciliation of God and man, Jesus also defeated Satan. Why? Well, if God does not have a relationship with man, like you and I, then man is at the mercy of Satan. Satan loves to hate and possess and use people. And when people are no longer defended and known by God, Satan can take full control. But by enabling reconciliation so that God can now know man, Jesus freed us from the power of Satan. Satan no longer can have his way with us because God now owns us and protects us. That's also why Satan knew that if Jesus suffered and died, Satan's defeat was sure. That's also why the temptation of Jesus in Matthew 4 is so important. Matthew 4, this temptation in the desert is where Satan tries to convince Jesus not to suffer and die. He tries to convince Jesus to give up his godness. Matthew 4, verse 8. The devil offers Jesus all of the kingdoms of the world, if only Jesus bows to Satan. And so Satan's real temptation there is to give Jesus the very thing that Jesus would have after he dies and is resurrected on the cross, or after the cross. Satan's temptation for Jesus is to give Jesus the thing he would achieve without the suffering and death. Satan's temptation in Matthew 4 is to tempt Jesus to take the easy way out. Which, by the way, this is going to come back later in the sermon when it comes to our suffering. And so Peter's rebuke of Jesus, right, why does Jesus call Peter Satan? Why? Jesus' rebuke of Peter is because let me say it differently. Peter's rebuke of Jesus is based on the same philosophy as the devil's temptation in the wilderness. Peter wants Jesus to become king over the world through human means and for human purposes. Peter wants Jesus to use his divine power to conquer the kingdoms of the world by human means and for a human kingdom. And that's what angers Jesus so much. He describes Peter's rebuke as satanic. It's not to say that Peter is Satan or that he's possessed by Satan. It's to say that Peter is thinking along the same lines as Satan. Peter is unwittingly a pawn of Satan. To conquer the world through human means for human purposes is to lose. Building a strong nation of Israel at the cost of conquering sin is defeat. The disciples still don't understand that for Jesus to be victorious requires suffering and death. And so Jesus commands Peter to get behind him so that Peter can learn to follow Jesus instead of trying to run in front of Jesus and tell Jesus what to do. Something we need to take careful note of as we move on. And so let's go to our second point, where Jesus begins to flesh out his way instead of Peter's way. Deny yourself and take up your cross. So Jesus tells Peter to get behind him. Follow me, he's saying. And Jesus then uses the occasion of this remarkable moment with Peter to teach something profound to the crowd. Look at what he says. He gathers the crowd together with the disciples, and now he's going to teach something important. What is it? Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Again, that's NIV. I know you all have ESV Bibles. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. The ancient pastor Chrysostom said this. He says, Jesus is telling his disciples, do not by any means imagine that by spending time with me, you're actually following me. For you should not expect, Peter, that because you confessed me Son of God, that there is only crowns to expect. And to suppose that this is enough for your salvation and security for the future. And Chrysostom goes even one step further, and listen carefully. Not only is it hurtful for Peter and destructive to hinder Jesus, but it will be impossible for you even to be saved unless you yourself be continually prepared for death. It will be impossible for you even to be saved unless you yourself be continually prepared for death. So not only does Jesus have to suffer and be rejected by men and die, but those who would follow him must be prepared to do the same. They must do the same first by denying themselves. This is to say that we are to abandon our desires and attachments to this world. It is to refuse to pay attention to my own desires and to want the desires of Jesus over my own selfish desires. That instead of thinking about what I want for myself, I think about what Jesus and my fellow brothers need or want. The Christian who seeks to follow Jesus must let his or her dreams of success and acclaim and comfort in this world die. This is the teaching of the Catechism, by the way. Question and answer 1. What is your only comfort in life and death? That I am not my own, but belong with body and soul, both in life and in death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. If you belong to Jesus, then your desires belong to him too. First. Now second, he who would follow Jesus must be ready to pick up his cross and carry it. What does that mean? Well, who other than Bonhoeffer to tell us what this means? The man who suffered in Nazi Germany at the hands of Hitler and his henchmen. Look at Bonhoeffer says. The cross means sharing the suffering of Christ to the last and the fullest. Every Christian has his own cross waiting for him. A cross destined and appointed by God. Every Christian has his own cross waiting for him. Each must endure his allotted share of suffering and rejection, but each has a different share. Some God deems worthy of the highest form of suffering and gives them the grace of martyrdom, while others he does not allow to be tempted above that which they are able to bear. But it is one and the same cross in every single case. Right? Some are given the fullness of suffering. That's martyrdom. It's an honor, by the way. And others are not to be tempted to that level or above that level. You see, brothers and sisters, despite our comfort in Canada, to believe in Jesus Christ who died shamefully on a cross, it's a belief that is not popular to this world. And by definition, choosing to follow Jesus is implicitly to become uncomfortable with the way that this world works and to endure the disrespect of the people around us. It's to invite opposition and difficulty. Now, this is still somewhat abstract, isn't it? We need to bring this closer to home a little bit, don't we? I mean, I read this week that in Pakistan they offered a job cleaning sewers only for Christians. If you're a Muslim, it's not a job for you, but if you're a Christian, that's a job that is for you. It's a way of persecution. But what about here in Toronto or Richmond Hill? What does carrying a cross look like here? What does that mean? And a friend of mine once told me a story that might help. The story about a man which he nicknamed Preacher Bob. You see, my friend spent many years of his life running a logging company in the coastal mountains of British Columbia. And one year he hired Bob to work on the logging crew. In the first weeks on the job, it became clear that Bob wasn't like other men on the crew. Bob didn't join in the crew joking or look at pornography or talk trash about women. Bob didn't join men in the bars on the weekend. Bob didn't do the other things that the things that the other men in the logging industry did. And so the men on the job began to call Bob Preacher Bob. My friend says, the irony was that Bob never preached at anyone. Bob simply went around his work and did his share. But my friend said that the reaction to Bob was visceral. At first, the crew hated him. They questioned his manhood. They pushed him around, and they did whatever nasty thing they could. They didn't like it that Bob was different. They especially didn't like it that he was righteous. My friend says, through the whole summer, Bob never responded with revenge or anger. Instead, over time, Bob began to bring cookies into work. He invited the men over to his house and on the weekend for coffee, and Bob treated everyone in the crew with kindness and respect, no matter what they did to him. And he never compromised his standards either. I would submit to you that Bob's cross was the rejection and the mockery of the logging crew. Bob had to deny himself in order to carry the cross. You see that, right? He had to deny his desire to fit in with the other men and receive their affirmation and praise because he had to serve Jesus instead. And by serving Jesus and denying his own desire, he had to carry a cross. And it's important to recognize here that when Jesus asks us to pick up our cross, he isn't talking about suffering in general. Even though this world is a world of suffering due to sin. Even a follower of Satan will suffer for Satan, right? So it's implausible to say that suffering itself is what's mentioned in this passage. No, Jesus is talking about a certain kind of suffering. Look what he says. Right? If we look at our passage. For whoever would, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And then, but for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for who? Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel will save it. So picking up a cross, your cross is suffering for Jesus. That makes sense. Jesus didn't suffer and die for general or in general. Jesus suffered and died for us to defeat sin and Satan. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. Now, there's a bit more to the story about Preacher Bob. My friend said this about Bob's impact on the logging crew. He said the results that summer were remarkable. Guys who had run him, and I quote, guys who had run him down behind his back and often to his face, began first to back down and eventually became Bob boosters. Men who had mocked him earlier in the year slowly changed their attitude. And while by summer's end they still called him Preacher Bob from time to time, it was no longer a nasty term. Remember the words of Jesus. Whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. Bob was ready to lose his life, metaphorically, in this case, his life, the good things in this life. And by standing on his convictions and living for Jesus, the gospel, and the good news, and by doing so quietly, faithfully, out of love, Bob gained the true life. The life in which Jesus is proclaimed loudly in every area of his life. He found his life by giving up the life of this earth. And this is the great irony, or the great benefit of this. He who is ready to give up his entire life for Jesus will receive true life for Jesus, both now and eternally. In fact, when you read the passage here, the word for loses his life is the same word for kill and destroy. So you could say in this, whoever is willing to destroy their earthly life for Jesus and the gospel will save their life. And in fact, brothers and sisters, what we learn here is that to be truly human, to live your full life, your best life, in the words of the prosperity gospel, to live your best life is to live entirely for Jesus. And Jesus teaches us that when you live for him, you become radiant. Jesus is proclaimed through every part of your life, and you are built into something far better than you could be otherwise. You are sanctified. And brothers and sisters, this is the great foundation of all evangelism, witness, and mission. Jesus basically could have said, whoever loses his life for my sake will be a witness to other men. In fact, there's a story told about Adoniram Judson, the first missionary to Burma in Southeast Asia. The story goes like this. For 7 heartbreaking years, Adoniram suffered hunger and privation. This was because he was thrown into Ava prison. For 17 months, and particularly in this prison, he was subjected to the almost incredible mistreatment. In fact, for the rest of his life, Adoniram Judson carried the ugly marks made by the chains and iron shackles that had bound him. Undaunted, upon his release from prison some years later, Adoniram asked the ruler for permission to enter a different province so that he could preach the gospel there. The godless ruler angrily denied his request. And he said this. He said, "My people are not fools enough to listen to anything a missionary might say. But I fear they might be impressed by your scars and turn to your religion. My people are not foolish enough to listen to what you say, but when they see your scars, they might decide to have a listen." You see, brothers and sisters, no evangelism technique or training can substitute for a Christian willing to sacrifice their whole life for Jesus. Nothing I teach my congregation or your congregation about mission and evangelism is a substitute for that. And this is a really, really difficult thing for you and I to accept. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Who of us can say that this statement does not describe us? You know, us wealthy North Americans, we like to spend most of our time having our feet in both camps. You see, we want the best of this world and heaven, don't we? just like Peter. I'm no different. I love to fill my life with thoughts of my next vacation, my plans to snowboard and ski next winter, the next car I'm going to buy. I love to think about decorating my house and my backyard, binging on Netflix, the latest TV series that I like. I tend to think that, suffering and hard things, that's an interruption of the good things I meant to have. I don't like it. I'd rather avoid discomfort, thank you very much. And in fact, in many ways, I've been able to structure my life to make that possible. Right? In fact, most of my friends live this way. They've managed to purchase homes outside of the city so they don't have to talk to people they don't like, people that don't look like them. Maybe they've moved to places like Owen Sound, so they definitely don't have to be near the city. And how many of us can say that we're truly living in these places and going to these places for the sake of Christ? I think we're going there to try to save our earthly life. But the truth is as clear as it is difficult. One commentator said it this way: the one for whom the way of Jesus is more important than his own existence will secure his eternal being. But the one whose existence is more important than Jesus will lose both Jesus and his life. And I want you to let that sink in. To love, and I'll say it this way, to love Christ and the world equally is to deny Christ. To think that you can have them both at the same time is to deny Christ. The fact is, if your faith has never led to discomfort in your life, something is probably deeply, eternally wrong. And that's not to say that we should seek suffering and martyrdom. That's not the point. But our faith should create a certain sense of discomfort with our world. It cannot be otherwise. It's exactly what Jesus is saying. And I want to twist the knife a little here. I'm going to do so through an article I found a while back called 8 Signs Your Christianity is Too Comfortable. 8 signs. And follow with me. You'll see if this describes you. Here's number 1. 8 signs your Christianity is too comfortable. Sign 1. If your faith aligns too perfectly with a certain political party. Number 2. There are no paradoxes or tensions or unresolved questions in your life. Your knowledge is that kind of knowledge that's never been tested by disagreement with people who oppose you. You have Facebook knowledge. The kind of knowledge that's reinforced by surrounding yourself with people who only agree with you and tell you things you want to hear. That's number 2. Number 3. Your Christianity is too comfortable if your friends and coworkers are surprised to hear that you're a church-going Christian. You've never told your friends about Jesus because it would make you too uncomfortable. Or number 4. You never think about or remember the Sunday sermon on Monday. Because you probably didn't come to church to listen, did you? You came to church to check off a box, to remind God of how faithful you are, so that he might get you into heaven. Number 5. Your Christianity is too comfortable if no one at your church ever annoys you. Might sound surprising. But here's the thing. We're sinners. Every church is full of a bunch of awful sinners. And the closer you get to the people at your church, the more they're going to annoy you. This is doubly true if you become a pastor. So if no one at your church annoys you, that's because you don't know anyone at your church, because you've never put anything into your church membership. That's number 5. Number 6. Your Christianity is too comfortable if you never feel challenged. If you spend your whole life only feeling affirmed. Why is that? Well, because you've lived your whole life and you've never bothered to look for idols. You'd rather just live your life thinking you're a pretty good person. You really don't feel like digging below the surface. That's too hard. But beware. Failing to do what's hard in this life may cost you the next life. Number 7. You've never had to have a truth in love conversation with a fellow Christian. You've never had those conversations because you don't care about your fellow brothers and sisters. Because church isn't that big of a deal to you. And number 8. Your Christianity is too comfortable if no one in your church could comment on any area of growth they've seen in you. If nobody's ever seen you grow, maybe it's because you're not growing. And brothers and sisters, you've got to think this through. You do not have the luxury of not taking this to heart. Do not think that sitting in this church and tuning into the live stream once or twice, if you're on a good day, is enough. Do not think that church is about checking a box to prove to God that you're actually a good person. That will end you up. That will lead you straight to hell. Reckon with what Jesus is saying. If these things are true for you, the things that we've described here, it indicates a lack of self-denial in your life. You've never picked up your cross. It's still laying on the ground beside you. Or worse, maybe it's stored in your closet somewhere. And Jesus says this. He continues, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? What can anyone give in exchange for their soul? What could we possibly be doing in our lives that's more important than giving our souls to Christ? Really? Can anything in this world give us eternity? Why is it that we as Canadian Reformed Christians spend our lives dabbling with Christianity when so obviously Jesus owns everything? As one author said, the world one can live without. But when one loses one's being or personhood, what can man give in exchange? And here's a church father. The true Christian would give everything he could, even the whole world, if he had it, for the sake of the gospel. The true Christian would give the whole world if he was able to possess it for the sake of the gospel. And of course, the irony here is that even if a man could gain the whole world, it itself would not make him happy. Find a rich man who's happy because of his wealth. You cannot. And finally, Jesus gives his strongest and most terrifying argument of all. One that ought to send a shiver of fear down your spine. Listen to it. For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, what? What happens to those who are ashamed of Christ? Of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Ouch. If anyone is ashamed of me in their workplace or in their family at the dinner table when they fail to do devotions, then I will be ashamed of him on the final day. Brothers and sisters, if you are not feeling sweat in your back, you are in trouble. That statement, this statement, should be terrifying. Nothing should terrify you more than this statement. Neither COVID, nor losing your job, or losing your savings. Nothing should terrify you more than this statement. The thing that you fear more than this statement is the idol you need to smash. And so, brothers and sisters, let's conclude. We'll conclude with a few thoughts. First, in this passage, Jesus is teaching us that following him is way more than knowing him. Or knowing about him, maybe I could say. To follow Jesus means to share in his suffering. And maybe even his death, if you're so honored. Secondly, this hard teaching is not meant in the first place to depress you or load guilt on you. The thrust of this passage is not Christians need to work harder and be better people. That's not the point. The gospel is that you and I, the good news is that you and I are deeply, deeply broken people, yet also deeply forgiven and loved in the sight of God. And so the thrust of this passage, the call to denial and taking up your cross, this is a call to repentance and belief more than anything else. Taking up your cross is a matter of abandoning the world and giving yourself to Jesus Christ. And that, brothers and sisters, is good for you. It's the way of love, and it's the way of beauty, and it's the way of eternity and bliss that nothing, the human mind cannot even imagine. And Jesus is a gracious, gracious master. When you serve Jesus, he empowers you to do the things he asks for. Augustine said it this way: what he commands is not difficult, since he helps effect what he commands. Our self-denial and suffering is good for us. It helps ground us. Suffering is a megaphone that shouts, this world is not for you. You need Jesus more than anything else in this world. This world is rotten and evil. And for those of you who have been suffering through COVID, through isolation or sickness or elsewhere, may it shout for your need for Jesus. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? So some of us need to pray that we lose our world. And no matter how often you and I fall, no matter how far you are for Jesus, he is always willing to forgive. Even Peter denied Jesus 3 times and was called Satan. Yet Jesus forgave him and restored him fully. The key thing, though, brothers and sisters, is that Peter, from the bottom of his heart, wanted to be restored. He jumped out of the boat in the last chapter of John to swim to see Jesus. Brothers and sisters, if you're willing to jump out of the boat and swim to see your Savior, then you can have everything that he has to offer you. Brothers and sisters, before you can truly know your Savior and follow him, you need to smash your vision of following a Messiah without suffering. That vision will lead to death. It assumes that Christ is compatible with this world, which is impossible. But brothers and sisters, you can have the victory with Jesus. You can be known by him. You can follow him. And he will give you every single thing that you need. And you will experience a joy with Jesus that nothing else in this world can offer. And so, brothers and sisters, this isn't a painful choice at all. There will be pain in following Jesus, but it will more and more than anything else, be compensated by love and joy. And so, brothers and sisters, go to your Savior, believe. Lay down your heart, get on your knees, go to whatever place in your house that you can be alone, and get on your knees and pray for Jesus to take your life over. And do not delay. The cost is too high. Amen.